right now, your favorite new song might have actually been created by a machine that has absolutely no concept of what a guitar really is.
Yeah, I mean, it didn't pluck a string, it didn't strike a drum,
Right.
and it definitely didn't push any air through a brass tube. Instead, it basically just solved a massive, probabilistic math problem.
Which is wild. Welcome to a brand new deep dive, everyone. Today we are decoding what our source material calls the third sonic revolution.
And it really is a revolution.
Yeah.
It's a complete departure from how humanity has understood acoustic space for, well, literally thousands of years.
Totally. And we're doing this by walking sequentially through some highly technical documentation we received, like a really rigorous slide deck breaking down the underlying architecture of AI-generated music.
Yeah, we're going to translate the dense neural network models, the latent space mapping, and those complex acoustic graphs into clear aha moments for you.
Because once you understand the actual physics of what is happening under the hood, you start hearing these tracks entirely differently. So let's get right into the foundational paradigm shift the material presents in those first few slides.
Right, the big idea here.
Yeah, it argues that AI isn't playing music at all. It is simply guessing the next physical shape of a sound wave.
Right, and to really grasp that, we have to contrast the traditional physical paradigm with the AI paradigm.
Okay, lay it out for us.
So in the traditional model, even if you're using digital instruments, there's a discrete triggering of a sound. You hit a key on a MIDI controller, and it tells the computer, to play a specific pre-recorded audio file of a piano.
Like a little virtual robot inside the computer pulling a file from a cabinet.
Exactly. But the AI paradigm skips that entirely. There is no virtual robot. There's no library of piano sounds.
Wait, no library at all?
None. Instead, the system absorbs vast amounts of global music data to just deconstruct the relationships between audio frequencies.
So it's really less like a musician pulling from a repertoire and more like a highly advanced weather forecasting model.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. Like meteorologists don't build a tiny physical miniature version of a storm inside a computer. They just feed current atmospheric data into a fluid dynamics model.
And that calculates the most probable trajectory of the next cold front.
Exactly.
Yeah, that is a much more accurate way to look at it. The AI applies complex statistical modeling to audio frequencies. And the way it organizes all that massive global music data is through something called latent space mapping.
Latent space. Right.
Right. It creates this massive multidimensional map of sound. So in this mathematical space, the acoustic characteristics of, say, jazz and piano are grouped together as coordinates.
Because they frequently appear together in the training data.
Exactly. Whereas death metal is located in an entirely different cluster on that map.
Let's ground this with the sequential progression outlined in the deck. The jazz example they use is fascinating.
Yeah, it really clarifies things.
So imagine the AI is generating a track, and at this exact millisecond, let's call it time t-1, the system has just output the sound of a jazz piano combined with some light drums.
Okay. Yep.
Now, it has to compute what happens in the very next millisecond, right? Time t0 to t+1. It looks at its current position in that latent space map and calculates the probabilities for the next acoustic step.
And the documentation maps out the math of that split-second decision perfectly. Because it's currently situated in the acoustic coordinates of jazz piano and light drums, its rules database calculates a 90% probability that the frequencies corresponding to a saxophone should be generated next.
Right, because statistically, within the genre conventions it was trained on, that is the most logical pattern hit.
It's the safest bet. But the calculation doesn't stop at the highest probability. It also calculates an 8% chance that the frequencies of an upright bass enter the mix.
Which also makes sense for jazz.
Sure, but then, and this is where it gets interesting, it leaves a 2% probability for a heavy metal guitar to just suddenly shred over the jazz beat.
A heavy metal guitar over light jazz drums.
Yeah. The material categorizes that 2% as a low probability anomaly.
But why even include that? Why not just stick to the 90% saxophone?
Well, the inclusion of those anomalies is what gives probabilistic models their creative edge. It's a statistical game. Usually the algorithm takes the safest, highest probability path. But variance is baked into the architecture.
So it occasionally takes a weird turn.
Right. Occasionally the system dips into those low probability anomalies, generating combinations of frequencies that a human composer might never logically put together, but the technically still fit the mathematical progression of the sound wave.
Okay, wait, I need to challenge this premise, though.
Go for it.
If the system is essentially this highly complex weather model, charting the most probable trajectory based on past data, how do we actually steer it?
What do you mean?
Well, if I'm using one of these tools like Suno or Udio, which the deck mentions, I don't want a random weather event. I want to dictate the outcome. How do I force the system to give me the 90% saxophone instead of, rolling the dice on the heavy metal guitar?
Ah, okay. We steer it through the mechanism of creation itself.
Hmm.
And this involves two distinct architectures working in tandem, the diffusion process and the transformer models.
Okay, slides 4 and 5. Let's dig in.
Right. So if the latent space database we just discussed is the blueprint, diffusion, and transformers, are the construction crew actually building the physical sound wave?
The source material uses the metaphor of a sculptor for the diffusion process, which is a super vivid image, but the mechanics of it seem honestly highly counterintuitive.
They really do.
Like, let's say I input a prompt that reads, crisp piano, a sad pop. The system doesn't start by mathematically assembling a piano.
No, it doesn't.
Step 2 of the process, immediately following the prompt, is the generation of pure noise, a block of absolute static.
Yeah, it seems totally backwards, but that is the defining characteristic of diffusion models. You begin with maximum entropy, just chaos.
Just a wall of hiss.
Exactly. And then step 3 is iterative denoising. The system analyzes that block of static, and step by step, it mathematically erases the audio frequencies that do not align with your prompt.
Wow.
Yeah. The final step is the clear audio waveform. So its primary function isn't to construct a piano sound, but to isolate and remove all the noise that isn't a piano.
Okay, I understand the sculptor metaphor now.
Yeah.
It's like Michelangelo looking at a block of marble and chipping away everything that isn't David.
Precisely.
But wait, Michelangelo knew what David looked like before he picked up the chisel. If the AI starts with pure static, how does it know what sad pop actually looks like in a waveform? Isn't it flying completely blind?
It would be flying blind if it weren't for the training data and the transformer architecture we mentioned.
Okay, the emotion engine.
Right. The system isn't guessing what sad pop sounds like in a vacuum. It references that multidimensional latent space map. It knows the mathematical coordinates of sad and pop, and it uses those as a template to guide the denoising process.
And the transformer translates the prompt.
Exactly. The transformer is the real workhorse here. It acts as the semantic to physical engine. It takes the abstract human concept of your text and literally forces it into acoustic physics.
The documentation actually provides a fascinating breakdown of this translation. Let's look at the prompt. Chorus, high energy.
Okay, classic prompt.
High energy is an abstract human feeling, right? The AI doesn't feel adrenaline, it doesn't have a pulse, so the transformer has to map that semantic emotion to physical waveform parameters.
And it splits this mechanical translation into two distinct acoustic parameters. First, it targets the VCA, the voltage-controlled amplifier, which dictates the amplitude or the volume of the wave.
So it just turns it up.
Right. To register high energy, the transformer maxes out the amplitude. It physically makes the waveform larger.
And the second parameter is the VCF.
Yes, the voltage-controlled filter, which governs the timbre and the frequency distribution.
And to achieve that high energy instruction, the deck says the transformer actively expands the frequencies in the 5 kilohertz to 20 kilohertz range.
Right, and there is a deeply rooted psychoacoustic reason for that specific frequency band. Human ears perceive the 5 to 20 kilohertz range as the air or the bite of a sound.
The bite, like the sharpness.
Exactly. It's where the harshness of a crash cymbal lives.
Yeah.
Or the really sharp breath of a pop vocal. So the system defines energy purely mechanically. Maximum amplitude combined with a dense concentration of high-frequency physics.
It is the literal quantification of emotion.
It really is.
But okay, if the system is this sophisticated, I mean, pulling from a massive multidimensional map, using transformers to perfectly quantify emotion, using diffusion to chisel pure audio out of static, why does the final product so often sound flawed?
Ah, the million-dollar question.
Right. If you listen closely to heavily generated tracks, there is almost always this distinct, blurry, kind of underwater quality to the audio.
Yeah, it's very recognizable. And the material addresses those auditory artifacts head-on in slide 6, attributing them to a phenomenon called the prediction gap.
The prediction gap.
Yeah, this is where the limitations of relying on statistical trajectories become glaringly obvious.
Let's break down the physics of this gap, because the graph in the documentation is super helpful here. It maps analog synthesis against generative AI.
Right, the two completely different approaches.
Analog synthesis produces a continuous, perfectly smooth mathematical wave. It's an unbroken voltage curve. But AI audio generation is inherently digital and discrete.
Exactly. It generates audio token by token in these microscopic digital steps.
So because it's working in discrete steps, it can't perfectly calculate an infinitely continuous analog curve.
No, it can't. It has to guess the trajectory of the wave between those digital steps thousands of times a second.
Which is where the Lego analogy comes in.
Yes. Imagine trying to build a perfectly smooth, sweeping arch out of square Lego bricks. You can get the general shape from a distance, but up close, the surface is jagged.
And the graph illustrates this beautifully. Overlapping the smooth analog wave is the AI's probabilistic prediction, which looks incredibly jagged.
And those jagged spaces between the perfect wave and the AI's wave are labeled prediction error deltas, or delta E.
Delta E. So those are the literal mathematical gaps between a perfect continuous curve and the machine's best probabilistic guess.
Right. Visually, it's just a shaky line on a graph. But orally, it profoundly impacts what you hear.
So if you've ever listened to an AI track and noticed the vocals suddenly sound like they're gurgling water, or my favorite, a snare drum sounds like it's literally melting into the bass line.
Yes, the melting drums.
You are hearing those delta E's. You are hearing the machine making thousands of microscopic errors in the actual atomic structure of the sound wave.
Exactly. Think about a human musician. They might play the wrong note entirely, but the acoustic wave of that wrong note is physically perfect.
Right, it's just the wrong pitch.
The AI, on the other hand, plays the right note, but the physical wave itself is structurally unstable.
That is such a fascinating distinction, and understanding the mechanics of that structural instability really forces us to place generative AI into a broader historical context.
Which the documentation does perfectly in slide 7.
Yeah, it presents a framework comparing the three distinct eras of music creation to show exactly how we arrived at this point.
Right. It breaks down into the synthesis, sampling, and generative AI.
And it applies a specific metaphor to each era to clarify the mechanism of control. So let's look at the first era, analog synthesis. The metaphor used here is clay.
Clay. It's a really precise metaphor because the mechanism of synthesis relies on manually adjusting the fundamental parameters of a sound wave, the oscillators and the filters.
You're getting your hands dirty.
Exactly. You are molding the audio from scratch, much like a sculptor working with clay. The primary strength of this era is absolute microscopic precision. You control the exact physics of the wave.
But the limitation of the clay era is realism, right?
Very much so. It is remarkably difficult to synthesize the complex, chaotic nuances of a physical instrument.
Yeah, you can spend hours tweaking oscillators, and your synthetic cello will still sound like a synthesizer, not a piece of wooden string.
Right. So to solve that, the industry shifted to the second era, sampling.
And the metaphor the source uses for the digital sampling era is a photo.
A photo. Because rather than building a sound wave from scratch, producers began capturing snapshots of physical reality.
The mechanism is the playback and manipulation of high-fidelity audio slices.
Exactly. You record an actual cello, you digitize the waveform, and you trigger it via a keyboard. The strength here is hyperrealism because you are utilizing actual acoustic recordings.
But the limitation of the photo era is confinement. You are entirely bound by your recorded assets.
You can't change what's in the photo.
Right. If your library only contains audio slices of a cello played softly, no amount of digital manipulation will make that specific sample sound like it's being played aggressively. You cannot generate data that isn't there.
Which transitions us perfectly to the focus of this deep dive. The third era, generative AI.
And the metaphor applied to this paradigm is a dream.
A dream. It just perfectly encapsulates the mechanism. Because as we established, it isn't molding clay and it isn't triggering a photo. It is statistically predicting the next waves based on a prompt.
So what's the strength of the dream?
Unprecedented generation. It can materialize full vocals, complex instrumentation, and intricate emotional delivery simultaneously. It totally bypasses the need for raw materials or physical execution.
But the limitation, and this is a big one, is a severe lack of granular control.
Every producer experimenting with these models hits this wall immediately.
Right. You cannot isolate or manipulate a single parameter. Let's say the model generates a brilliant chorus, but the hi-hat is slightly too loud. You cannot simply reach into the mix and turn down the hi-hat.
No, you can't. In the sampling or synthesis eras, that hi-hat would be on an isolated track.
But in the generative AI era, there are no tracks.
None. There's only one single, continuous, dreamed-up audio file. It is a fully baked cake. You cannot unbake it to remove a little bit of sugar.
And if you attempt to fix that hi-hat by slightly altering your text prompt, say adding quieter hi-hats, the system doesn't just adjust the drums, does it?
Oh no. It recalculates the entire probabilistic trajectory. It hallucinates an entirely new, different dream.
So you lose the brilliant chorus you were trying to preserve in the first place.
Exactly. It's incredibly frustrating for traditional producers.
Which makes sense because the nature of the tools has shifted so radically from the highly controllable clay to the realistic photos to the holistic but uncontrollable dreams. So the individual utilizing those tools must also undergo a fundamental evolution.
Yes, and that brings us to the final section of our source material, examining the shifting role of the creator.
The transition in skill sets here is stark. During the synthesis era, the creator functioned essentially as the engineer.
Right. Their primary concern was the atomic structure of the audio. They required a deep understanding of voltage, frequencies, and signal flow just to manipulate the clay.
But as the technology moved into the sampling era, the creator evolved into the assembler.
The focus elevated from the physics of a single wave to the macro arrangement of pre-existing assets. The skill was in chopping, stretching, and organizing those high-fidelity photos on a timeline.
And now, operating within the generative AI paradigm, the creator must transition into the director.
The director. The skill set shifts entirely away from mechanical execution and physical arrangement.
The creator's sole interface with the system is their overarching intent. The text prompt is the new instrument.
The prompt is everything now. The documentation frames this transition as a shedding of technical drudgery to allow for pure emotional translation.
So the director doesn't need to understand how to route a signal through a voltage-controlled amplifier.
Not at all. They only need to know how to clearly, precisely articulate their creative vision to the algorithmic engine.
The material crystallizes this idea in its conclusion perfectly. It argues that technical mastery is rapidly giving way to emotional clarity.
It posits that the future of music creation will not belong to the individuals who possess the dexterity to manipulate complex hardware, but to those who possess the vocabulary to feed the clearest instructions into the latent space.
It effectively removes the physical barrier to entry that has defined musical creation for centuries. You no longer need thousands of hours of muscle memory practice to materialize a complex symphony.
It's completely democratized the execution phase.
Right. The challenge is no longer about whether your fingers are fast enough. It's about whether your imagination is precise enough to guide the machine's probabilistic math. Let's just take a quick moment to look back at the massive scope of the material we've decoded today.
We covered a lot of ground.
We really did. We began by dismantling the idea of virtual instruments, establishing that AI operates as a complex statistical model, basically charting the most probable trajectory of a sound wave through multidimensional latent space.
Right, and then we explored those highly counterintuitive mechanisms of creation. We saw how diffusion models act as sculptors by erasing non-compliant frequencies from pure static.
Which is still mind-blowing to me.
It is. And how transformer models act as engines, forcing abstract semantic emotions into the strict physical parameters of amplitude and high-frequency bands.
Then we analyzed the inherent flaws of the system, identifying that prediction gap. We looked at how the discrete digital nature of the AI fails to perfectly map a continuous analog curve, resulting in those microscopic delta-E errors.
The melting drum.
Exactly, the distinct blurry artifacts we hear in generated audio. And finally, we placed this technology into historical context. We track the evolution of electronic music from the precise manual clay of the engineer to the realistic photos of the assembler, and ultimately to the holistic, unpredictable dreams of the director.
We've really traced the architecture of this revolution, from the atomic physics of a sound wave all the way up to the philosophical function of the artist.
We have, but to close out this deep dive, I want to leave you, the listener, with a thought regarding how this technology will inevitably alter our culture.
Oh, this is a great point.
Right. At the start of this discussion, we talked about the undeniable physicality of traditional music, the calloused fingers on a fretboard, the breath control required for a brass instrument, the sheer muscle memory.
It takes decades to master.
It does. And culturally, we have always equated that extreme physical dexterity with genius. We give those individuals the title of virtuoso.
Right.
But if the core thesis of this material holds true, if the physical barrier of technical mastery is permanently bypassed, and the act of creating music becomes basically an exercise in articulating emotional intent to a probabilistic engine, How will our cultural definition of a virtuoso adapt?
It has to change.
It does.
Yeah.
Will the revered musical geniuses of the next century be the individuals with the most unparalleled physical dexterity, or will they simply be the ones armed with the deepest, most precise emotional vocabulary?
That's a huge question.
It is. It's something to carefully consider the next time you hear a flawless track and wonder, just for a moment, who or what is actually dreaming up the audio.